Those women are not ladies. I'm author Elizabeth Ann West, and welcome to Chapter 6 of For the Love of a Bennet. After 3 days at the glacial pace of 10 miles per day, Lydia's patience had long worn out, and Elizabeth's was becoming very thin. Lydia behaved particularly sour because the regiment, traveling by carriage, wagons, and foot, would not remain in London proper, but marched around the grand city. "Is there no end to this?" Lydia exclaimed for the 100th time. "We have remained on the road and not stopped one moment for anywhere fun." "There is an end to this," Elizabeth said quietly. "It is in Brighton." Lydia made an unpleasant face as a retort to her sister. Elizabeth sighed. She had suspected the plans would be to avoid the city proper. She had been to London with Jane many times, and never once witnessed a militia regiment as large as the one commanded by Colonel Forster paraded through the streets down Piccadilly through Cheapside. Her youngest sister, however, being far less traveled, had counted mightily on the long journey to include shopping at the most fashionable shops. Thus her mood would not recover. "I know what will remedy your predicament, my friend," Mrs. Harriet Forster said, energetically, trying to cheer Lydia's spirits. "When you and your sister return home, in a few months' time, surely you could stop in London and visit your aunt and uncle." Unfortunately, Miss Forster was not acquainted with the side of Lydia's personality that suffered disappointments with tantrums and refused to pivot in perspective once her aim was set. Lydia continued to sniff and cry at varying intervals as she allowed herself to dwell in her sorrows. "But it shall be too late! My whole plan was to arrive in Brighton with all the other ladies fawning over my latest bonnet or new spencer," Lydia said indignantly, and Elizabeth raised her eyebrow at Mrs. Forster. Closer in age to herself, Elizabeth failed to understand why Mrs. Forster found such a friend in Lydia. The two women shared easy ways at a card table, and both loved theatrics and parlor games, but their maturity levels could not be further from one another. "Instead of finding sadness for something you were never promised, find joy in what the Lord has provided," Elizabeth said, and Lydia stuck her tongue out at her. "You sound like Mary," she said. Elizabeth shrugged and pulled out the only book she had found in her father's library that talked of Brighton at all. Unfortunately, the tome kept referring to the town by its older name, Brighthelmstone. She almost didn't select a description of Brighthelmstone and the adjacent country, or the new guide for ladies and gentlemen using that place of health and amusement. But an old map of her father's on the wall in his library showed the old town name on the coast, instead of Brighton. In her opinion, there was little wonder that they changed the name. Brighthelmstone was quite a mouthful. "Suit yourself," Elizabeth chided, washing her hands of Lydia's dramatic behavior in such a confined space. "I am content that we did not stop in London. I shall have more pin money to peruse the shops of Brighton." Lydia ceased her sniffling, as she was intrigued that her sister could say such a thing. After all, how could the offerings of Brighton compare to those of London? "What could Brighton boast that London cannot?" Elizabeth smirked. Years of experience with Lydia's fits had taught her the best way to handle them was to ignore trying to solve them. In Meryton, her youngest sister became cross over who entered the carriage first, or who had the first selection of shoe roses. There was never any use in trying to convince Lydia she was not slighted. Instead, the trick was to agree with her and make her curious about what she was missing out on. "We live just 30 miles of good road from London at any other time. It is never any difficulty to visit our aunt and uncle, as Mrs. Forster pointed out. But Brighton? I believe this might be the only time in my life that I may have the opportunity to visit the shore." Elizabeth did not mention that by the time they returned from London, the Gardiners were very unlikely to be home, and instead in the middle of their trip to the lakes. With a yawn, Elizabeth began to read and wait for Lydia to comprehend her meaning and develop a new outlook on their predicament. Lydia sat up straighter in the carriage that was moving barely a few miles per hour, eager to boast of her newest idea. "So what we find and purchase in Brighton shall be exotic. London can't have everything that other towns and villages have, especially not those on the coast. Mary King and the Long sisters won't be able to find the same fabric and steal my designs." Lydia laughed triumphantly. A few moments later, Lydia earnestly asked Mrs. Forster if she had any intelligence as to the diversions they should find in Brighton. Elizabeth rolled her eyes, as that particular conversational exchange had passed no less than half a dozen times since they left Hertfordshire. "The social life in Brighton, I am told, runs with more rhythm than you are accustomed," Mrs. Forster recounted, her eyes lighting up as she suddenly thought of a new connection to make about a subject so wholly exhausted by discussion. "I'm certain they are influenced by the tides. Yes, sea folk are very tied to their constancy. Penelope Lennox details there is a ball every Monday, and everyone hosts card games on Wednesdays and Thursdays." Mrs. Forster recounted every last detail she had from the letters of Penelope and Persephone Lennox, two sisters that were the daughters of the Major General of Preston Barracks. Elizabeth could practically recite the letters from the Lennox sisters word for word, and giggled to herself when she thought of doing such a thing in her next letter to Jane, if for no other reason than as a mental exercise. She turned back to her book to read about Henry VIII's castles being removed for carriage travel. "Among the number of castles built by Henry VIII for defending the sea coast was that situated at some distance from the edge of the cliff, and called the Blockhouse, the ruins of which were to be seen a few years ago. The castle, which was not large, was erected around the year 1539. The continual attacks of the sea gradually carried away the intermediate land, and at length the waters encroached to the very foundations, which they undermined. In consequence hereof, the interior tower fell down, and the ruins were to be seen under the cliff in the year 1761. Since that time, what remained of the castle has been removed, in order to afford a more convenient passage for carriages." The travel book continued in a similar fashion, dryly describing the seaside town, by a man who suffered from some ailment or another. In every chapter he extolled the restorative powers of a Dr. Russell and his insistence on sea bathing and drinking seawater as a panacea for all conditions. "Do you think we shall be allowed to go sea bathing?" Elizabeth asked, interrupting the topic of diversions with one she was most interested in. "Oh, not me. The waves positively frighten me," Mrs. Forster said, and Elizabeth recalled that Harriet Forster hailed from the northern England, where storms whipped along the coast, lashing against the rocky cliffs. "I believe the seas to be much calmer in Brighton. The numerous ports along the coast imply the existence of many safe harbors." Elizabeth turned her book sideways on a page of a crude map of the coastline. She offered the book to her companions, but only Mrs. Forster took a closer look. "Why would you want to go sea bathing, Lizzie? I suspect it is rather unpleasant, and shall make you reek like a fishmonger." Lydia wrinkled her nose after teasing her sister's idea. Elizabeth ignored her sister, but hinted that her book said seawater was most helpful for a clearer complexion. Lydia changed her mind and became quite interested in the prospect of braving the big carts that wheeled ladies into the sea and back again. So long as she had someone to go with her, Elizabeth was content. A change occurred for the large caravan, signaled by their carriage slowing to a standstill. Lines of soldiers trooped past them on either side, with a great swell of noise and dirt thrust into the air. Lydia squealed in delight at the sudden change of environment outside the window. Elizabeth began to breathe uneasily as the coach suddenly felt far too confining, and her mind imagined the two lines of men upsetting the vehicle. Her heart had to remind herself such an outcome was unlikely, and the circumstances would pass. "Lizzie, we could walk. Oh, let's do so. Let's get out of the carriage and walk with the men. Look, those ladies are doing so," Lydia exclaimed as she pointed to three women on her side flirting and walking with the regiment. Mrs. Forster's face paled, and Elizabeth grabbed Lydia's arm that had moved to the door handle. "Lydia, stop!" she cried, as Lydia instinctively fought back against Elizabeth's grasp of her hand. "We're barely moving. I shan't get hurt stepping down, only for a spell," Lizzie argued, and the two sisters' hands were a flurry of slaps and scratches against each other. Mrs. Forster cried out at such a display, and Elizabeth had to yell over her. Briefly, the carriage door flung open, and Elizabeth tumbled over her sister to slam it closed once more. "Those women are not ladies," she said so loud her voice carried through the glass window into earshot of the closest men marching alongside the carriage. They involuntarily looked to their right, directly to the window, before resuming the call to attention to the front. Thankfully, they passed by, and Elizabeth breathed more easily. Her shouting and words also made Lydia stop her childish antics. "What do you mean? We walked all the time back home, so they cannot afford a carriage," Lydia began to scold her sister for being so superior, but it was Mrs. Forster who explained. "My friend, I'm afraid my invitation was cruel. There are parts of the world of being a virtuous soldier's wife that you must overlook. Though I had much the same reaction as you when I first married my colonel," Mrs. Forster confessed. "There are women who travel with the men to provide them relations that should certainly only happen within the confines of a marriage." "So they're married to those men they walk with," Lydia misunderstood, and Elizabeth shook her head. "No, they are fallen," she said in a cold tone. Lydia huffed as the carriage began to move again, not fully understanding the explanation, but no longer wishing to appear ignorant. The pace of the vehicles now outstripped the marching pace of the regiment, and they were back to vistas of countryside within the quarter hour. After Elizabeth again returned to her book, Lydia whined about when the next stop would occur, and she wisely left answering her sister to Mrs. Forster. By the time she finished the next chapter, Elizabeth looked up to see Lydia fast asleep, with her head against the doorframe, and Mrs. Forster knitting. The two women exchanged a nod of relief and returned back to their solitary activities. Hopefully in a few more days they could reach Brighton. But for the night they would rest in Twickenham, where they would pick up provisions of gunpowder, or so Elizabeth recalled from Colonel Forster's talk at dinner the night previously. The slow-moving carriage and lack of interest in her book soon lulled Elizabeth to sleep as well, even though, usually when she traveled, it was her greatest wish to enjoy the company of the carriage and see the sights. For this trip, however, she only found peace avoiding both. Thank you for listening. This book is available for sale on all major vendors, including paperback and ebook, on Amazon, Apple's iBook Store, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, and Kobo. If you enjoyed this chapter and would like to help others find it to enjoy, please consider pressing the like button or thumbs up on your device. YouTube also offers the ability to subscribe to my channel entirely for free so that you never miss a chapter posting. Finally, I am so grateful to all of my readers who purchase my books to fund projects like this. If you are a regular reader or visiting with me for the first time, please consider leaving a comment. Like a lady of the house in Regency times, I consider each one to be a calling card, and I answer each and every comment. You are the best fan an author could ask for. Until we visit again.